Thousands of families in the UK have outgrown their home. Our most commonly asked question is, can I have a loft conversion and how much does it cost? Before we get into the big question of how much does it cost, we need to understand what type of loft conversion we're talking about. Now, at the moment, we're sitting in something called a Mansard loft conversion. It's the creme de la creme. It's the whole roof off. It's a complete rebuild. That is the top of the tree. We've got a dormer loft conversion. We've got a hip to gable dormer loft conversion. And then we've got what's most commonly called in the UK a Velux loft conversion. Now, depending on what type of home you live in or home you own, that is going to determine which type of loft conversion is right for you. Let's start with what the minimum head height requirements are. That's going to answer, can I do it? Now, depending on the steepness of your pitch of your roof, that is going to determine something called ridge height. Now, we need to see a minimum of 2.35 to 2.4 meters at a minimum. What's the difference between head height and ridge height? The ridge height is the difference between the ridge beam and the top of the floor in the existing property. We need to make the floor thicker. We need to make the rafters thicker in order to accommodate things like the strength of the floor and the insulation in the rafters. That's going to take your ridge height and shrink it down to about 2.1 if you have a ridge height of about 2.4. Let's run through a list of preliminary costs you can expect on your project regardless of what type of shape your roof is. Building control, structural engineer, scaffolding, maybe some architect, maybe some planning, and maybe some permitted development costs. Let's run through what each of them look like now. Building control. In order to get your home insured, you are going to need a building certificate that says it's been done to a good standard and it meets the regulations. You need to budget a cost. We would always put somewhere between £1,000 and £1,500 for the inspector to come out and inspect the builder's work. Pretty normal process. The builder should organise this and he or she can also include this in their quote. So make sure that when you're comparing your contractors, you look for, have the contractors both included building control costs, or is this something that you're going to have to pay for separately? Structural engineer. Structural engineers are needed in order for the building control officer to be able to say it's been done right. They need some calculations to make sure that the builder or contractor has put the right timber, strength, steels, etc. in the right place. There is going to be a cost associated. Either the contractor is going to put it in their quote or you need to budget it separately. We would always allow between £1,000 and £1,500 for this. There are some engineers that will do it cheaper. There are some engineers that is more expensive. This gives you a ballpark to think about. Scaffolding. This is the only thing that's a little bit dependent on the project. So for a Velux loft conversion, you're going to need a different requirement for scaffolding than what you are going to need on a hip to gable or a Mansard. These can range from £2,000 to £20,000. £2,000 is going to be at the absolute minimum of what's required to get access into the home. The £20,000 means you are wrapping your entire home all the way around. It's most commonly called a top hat, and this is what it looks like. Architects. Architects don't necessarily need to get involved. It really depends on your complexity of your own project. Some loft conversions we've done 20 of them before in the same street, and that's absolutely fine. We know what the challenges are going to be. If you are new to this and you feel uncomfortable about it, go and find a good architect. They will be your friend, your colleague, and your helper through this little journey. Allow £2,000. Again, you might find some that are £1,500, you might find some that are £4,000. We're hitting the middle of the road and we're going to call this £2,000. Since we're talking about architects, let's talk about planning versus permitted development. Now, permitted development is a set of rights that you have as a homeowner to modify your own home. Providing you sit inside these guidelines, you might not need planning. We've done a whole video on it. It's going to pop up in this corner. If you want to know the intricate details, you can go and have a look at that. Do your own research. Some new build developments have gotten rid of your permitted development rights. So straight away, you know you go for planning. If you are unsure, check with your local council. Basically, permitted development means you can do a loft conversion on your house, and as long as you use like-for-like materials and you've got everything else covered, you can do it. Don't need planning. Cost saving. Let's talk about planning. Planning is not as scary as what you think it might be. It's a process of you submit your plans with what you'd like to do, some existing elevations, a site plan. There is a time process that you have to go through. People can comment on whether they think you should be able to do it. Most simple loft conversions go through very, very quickly, and they're quite easy because they may fall just outside of permitted developments. Big Mansards projects, you guys are more than likely going to need planning. Get your head around that, follow the process, be communicative, it will be fine. There's two elements that we need to think about here to form the structure in a Velux truss roof conversion. So we've got to think about the floor and we've got to think about the rafters. Now both of those, because we're taking all the internals out of the trusses, they're not going to be strong enough. So we need to put two big steels, most commonly down the long edge of the building. That's going to then form a dwarf wall, which is going to support the thicker rafters that need to be bolted next to the existing ones. They sit in between the two steel beams that have been installed. That means the floor's now strong enough and the roof is now strong enough. A dormer is a square box that you see at the back of a lot of loft conversions. Again, there's two elements that we need to think about. We have to think about what's supporting the rafters and the ceiling, and we've also got to think about what's supporting the floor. Let's start off with the ridge. The ridge normally has a big beam running from end to end, normally near the chimney breast and near the external wall to support the two ends of the ridge beam. Once that's in, you can then install the walls of the dormer, or the cheeks as they're most commonly called. Once the cheeks are up, you're then able to put the new flat roof joists in. That is going to form the shape of your new dormer. In the floor, similar to the Velux loft conversion, we need to get something to support the front elevation of the house. So we do a similar process. We put a steel beam in on the floor and then we build a dwarf wall up off of that in order to support either the existing rafters or a new set of thicker, stiffer rafters, depending on what the span is. Again, all of this is going to be specified by the structural engineer, and your builder just needs to follow the instructions and make sure they put the right steels in the right place. Let's talk about the definition of a hip to gable. That's when we're taking the hip of the roof and we stand it up vertically to form a gable end, hence hip to gable. Similar to the Velux loft conversion and the dormer loft conversion, we've got to think of two things. We need to get something that's going to support the ridge, and we need to get something that's going to support the floor. The ridge beam commonly sits on a post which is very, very close to the chimney breast, normally on the spine wall of the house. At the other end, once you've built your new gable wall up, that's going to support the other end of the ridge beam. Like all of them, we need to think about the floor. The roof's relatively simple in comparison to what the floor construction is. The floor most commonly won't be stiff enough in order to support a habitable space. It was designed originally to be a ceiling. So normally what happens is we've got to put a taller, stiffer floor in, and one end of that normally needs to be supported by a steel beam. That steel beam also, like the Velux conversion, supports the rafters on top of a dwarf wall. All of this is specified by the engineer. So your construction company or your builder is going to follow the instructions set out by the engineer and use things like pad stones or load spreader plates in order to support the steel in the appropriate place. From there, in loft conversions, there's lots of timber used in order to be able to build up off things, and things like webbing out the steel so that the timbers have got something to be nailed into. The Mansard loft conversion is going to be the difference in all of these. This is going to be completely custom to what your build is. Most commonly we see an increase of the wall plate on the either one or all four elevations. That wall plate then supports either a crank beam or a series of beams that form the shape of the new dormer. Once the steel structure is in and all bolted together, then it's a case of normal carpentry techniques in order to form a cut roof around what the shape of the steel is. All of the engineer's calculations will be to make sure that in the event that we have loads and loads of snow, doesn't happen a lot down here in the southwest, but I know up north and in parts of London, you guys are going to get lots of snow. Those calculations are going to make sure that your new Mansard roof is stiff enough and strong enough in order to carry all of the weight of that lovely white fluffy stuff. So here's the cost here for the structure on the Velux loft conversion. Dormer build, hip to gable dormer, And finally, here's an estimation of what the cost for the structure on a mansard is. With all of the structure built in your new loft conversion, it's time now to think about roofing. Really important part of it, so let's run through our 4 categories. In the Velux conversion, there's not a lot of roofing to be done. However, the name suggests we need to put some roof lights in. So how many Veluxes you guys choose to put in is completely up to you. The more Veluxes you have in, the more natural light that comes into this space. With your Velux installed in your new Velux loft conversion, that is essentially the roofing component done. Now these dormers are most typically done in older style housing, so the first thing we need to do is inspect what both elevations are like. One of the elevations is going to be completely rebuilt, so let's just ignore normally the rear elevation. Let's park that to one side and focus on the front. So in your dormer loft conversion, there's no need to replace your front elevation. It's really going to depend on what the condition of it is. If the conditions of it's poor, then replace it. You've got the scaffolding up. That's going to create a cost element that is different to what a standard conversion can be. So keep that in mind. Am I replacing the front elevation when I'm doing my dormer conversion? Under permitted development, the roof needs to stay looking the same. So if you've got slates, replace them with slates. If you've got a double Roman style roof, then put those back on. Hips and valleys is something to think about, because while you're doing your roof, replace all of them because they do wear out. Now that the structure's built on your dormer, the flat roofing component needs to be done. We use a product called Sarnafill. It's a single ply membrane. We use our mate Lee Mark's roofer down in the southwest. He's amazing. He makes it look really easy, but essentially the membrane is welded together using some heat that creates a single membrane on top of your roof. One thing also to consider is there's 2 types of flat roofs. You can do a warm roof and a cold roof, and there's loads of YouTube videos out there about the difference between the 2 of them. Depending on what your head height is probably going to determine whether or not you're using a warm or a cold roof, or a mixture of both. The roofing component in a hip to gable was really similar to a dormer because they're really similar builds. Once we've actually taken the hip and turned it into a gable, they're essentially the same. Think about your front elevation. Do I need to replace that? Once that's done, we've simply got the flat roofing component on the top of the dormer. The main sort of area we need to think about is what it looks like where it joins against the neighbour's property if it's a semi-detached house. The cheeks of the dormer are commonly used in the same roofing material as what the original roof was. So if you're a slate roof, slate cheeks. Another common thing that we use is a cement fibre cladding. It looks quite modern and new, but yet sort of pays tribute to the old house as well. The other roofing component that we need to have a think about is the flashings around the chimneys. Redo these while you're in the process. They do wear out, and new lead will last way longer. The roofing component of a mansard is really different. It's roof off, roof on. It's going to be a complete new roof. So let's park that one and just make sure that your builder or construction firm has allowed for a full roof replacement instead of trying to tie into old roofs. So let's add into our structure cost the roofing. The Velux, the roofing cost for the dormer. Here's one for the hip to gable dormer. And then here's an estimate for a mansard. Now that we've walked through the cost of the structure and the roofing, let's just talk really briefly about insulation. Now each build is going to be slightly different depending on what the building control requirements are, but there are a minimum standard and you can choose to go way over that or stick to the standards. It's completely up to you. One other thing to think about here is the fire break in between the bedrooms of the existing house and the new loft conversion. Bunch of controversy around wire mesh and plasterboarding, but essentially we need to create a break between the original house and the loft conversion to make it longer for people to get out in the event of a fire. There's 2 ways you can do that. You can chicken mesh the floor, fill it with rock wool insulation, or you can reboard the ceiling in the existing bedrooms. Completely up to you, really going to depend on what features your home has. So we're now at a point in our build where we've got the structure built and the roofs are on. Yay, we're in the dry. We've probably insulated in. Before we go and start with the plasterboarding process, we need to have a think about what we're doing in the bathroom. Make sure your first fix, plumbing and everything is done. You've got your soil pipes in for your toilet, you've got your waste pipes in for your basins or your showers. And this really needs us onto the bathroom section, which is completely individual. You can put a really simple bathroom in, you can tile the whole thing from floor to ceiling. You can have gold plated taps and toilets. You could have a granite toilet seat, or you could just have a bog standard screw fix off the shelf, completely up to you. Here's a quick look at some of the bathrooms that can be done and what can be achieved in them. And just to make it comparable, we're going to put in a generalized cost. So we haven't put a cost in for the Velux because bathrooms are quite hard to fit. Here's the cost for the dormer, the cost for the hip to gable dormer, and finally, here's the cost for the bathroom in the Mansard. The stairs are something that is individual to your property and is quite difficult to price. We're going to put in some rough numbers. We use a company called Stairbox. They are very good. They have a wonderful tool online which all of the boys use. You can expect to pay between £500, £600, £700 all the way up to £5,000, £6,000, £7,000 depending on what your materials, whether or not you are using an oak tread, whether or not there's a balustrade, whether it's painted, whether it's raw material, whether it's MDF or pine. We're not going to get into that. We're going to put here is a framework that you guys can work off for a staircase because it's really important. So here's the cost for the staircase in the Velux, the cost for the dormer, the cost for the hip to gable dormer, and the cost for the Mansard. Now that we're all insulated and if we're having a bathroom, we've got all the first fix done, now it's time to start thinking about finishes. Now the plasterboarding is sort of the first step and then we're moving on to plastering. Now there's two types of ways you can plaster a loft conversion. You can dry line it, which is where you simply plaster all of the cracks in the plasterboard sheets, or you can plaster the whole thing using a gypsum base multi-finish troweled on product. Most of the time in the UK you'll see everyone plaster the whole things. Around the rest of the world they often dry line. Once we're plastered, it's really time to think about second fix carpentry, so things like skirting, architrave and doors. Once that's on, it's time for the painters to come in and it really starts to take shape. Now the costings in this can be quite different depending on, for example, white paint on the walls is cheaper than a really dark color in comparison to a white ceiling. So take that into consideration. We'll just put some numbers on a white finish so you guys have got some ideas. Here's the cost for the finishes in the Velux, for the dormer, for the hip to gable dormer, and finally here's a finishing cost for those of you doing a Mansard. Moving on from the finished room, we're in a position now where the bathroom's done, maybe that's tiled, we've got the plaster on the wall, everything's really starting to come together. We now have a bunch of extras that we can choose to throw at it. Things like a boiler. Now, why would we be talking about a boiler when we're talking about a loft conversion? It's a long way for your current boiler to pump water all the way up to the bathroom. Something to think about is, do I need to change the boiler for a more reliable or maybe something with a more heavy duty pump? Or is it simply going to be easier to put an electric hot water shower in the loft? Also means that if there's ever a gas outage, you've always got a hot shower. Something to think about. Radiators vary quite significantly in costs. You can have an off-the-shelf sort of screw fix or tool station specification rate, or you can also go into something that's a little bit more in keeping with the age of the property. Completely up to you. For the purpose of this, we're going to go for something that is standard family home spec, really good quality. It's going to put out a good bunch of heat and keep the space nice and warm. Now that we've got the function part sorted, we're plastered, we're painted, all the skirting's on, we've got some radiators on the walls, let's have a chat about flooring. Now depending on what type of space you're going to be using your new loft conversion for, if it's an office it may have a slightly different flooring than what you would have paid for a bedroom. This can have a reasonable impact on the cost. Something for example like a luxury vinyl tile or an LVT as it's commonly called. That's going to set you back about £35 a square metre, where you could go for something like carpet, which is going to be significantly less, maybe to £12 to £15 a square metre. Again, it's completely up to you guys. There is no rhyme or reason behind what has to go on the floor. Other extras that you can think about are things like built-in wardrobes, sunken shelving. All of these do have an impact on the cost, so make sure that if you're comparing builders against builders, that you make sure that they're all pricing for the same thing, so it's a direct comparison. Custom made joinery is really expensive. 2, 3, 4,000 pounds a unit is not uncommon, depending on what your design is, and obviously IKEA don't make anything off the shelf with a roof pitch of 26.25 degrees, so you may have to leave some space in your budget in order to make sure that you can put some custom joinery in. Other things to consider are, if you haven't done your standard Velux loft conversion, do I want additional roof lights or do I want additional features as far as the lighting in my house? Most loft conversions, the ceiling height or the head height is way too low to put pendant lighting in, so we normally end up putting spotlights. That's pretty much standard, but in your particular application it might be different, something to think about. For the purpose of this exercise, we'll just allow for spotlights to be evenly spaced around the room. This one's a hard one to put some numbers around because it really depends on what you're doing. So in the Velux we've allowed this, including a boiler. For the dormer we haven't swapped the boiler because most of the time we don't need to. Here's the cost for that. Here's the cost for the hip to gable dormer, again with no boiler. And finally, here's your cost for the Mansard. One thing we've touched on really lightly throughout this whole video is fire regs. Now there are some regulations that will change around fire protecting your new level up, your new habitable space up in the loft. So things like we need to create a break in between the existing bedrooms and your new loft conversion. Now what a break is a break is the amount of time that it takes for something to burn through. So the standard regulations are 60 minutes. We need to create 60 minutes of time to get out of the building before the fire breaches through. So we spoke a little bit before about the chicken mesh and the insulation in the floor, or you can pink board the ceiling below it. That's up to you. There will need to be something in. I know people have told me before that they've put smoke alarms in every room, and building control have been fine with that. One thing that needs to be thought about is the fire doors that need to be installed all the way around the house. Now the easiest thing to do here is to have a conversation with your building inspector. Let the contractor or the building company have those conversations about what needs to be taken care of, and in your case just put a budgeted allocated amount for fire protecting. We'll put that in here under a separate line because there are various ways of doing it depending on what the inspector wants to see. So for this we're going to allow £2,000 as a contribution towards whatever fire solution you guys need to come up with your building inspector. So let's look at some totals. Here's where it all sits. For the Velux conversion, you're coming in at a shade under £50,000. For a dormer, you guys are coming in at a shade over £60,000. For the hip to gable dormer, again, just over £70,000. And for the Mansard, here is a rough costing depending on what your particular project is, at a shade under £150,000. Wow. That's a lot of money, but you get a lot of house for it. And that is the end of the complete guide to loft conversions in 2026. We hope you've enjoyed it. We hope you've learned something, and maybe this has helped you on your journey to make your house better suited for your family. If you have enjoyed it, please consider hitting the thumbs up. Consider subscribing to the channel. We've really enjoyed having you here. We will see you guys next one. Thanks a lot. Bye.